So welcome back, everybody. I guess the benefit of doing this online, you weren't rushing off to some restaurant. Of course, the downside was you were staring into your refrigerator trying to find something to eat, perhaps. So this morning we had Andolyn as our co-trainer, and this afternoon you get to meet Carrie. Carrie, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Kronberg with ICF. Happy to be joining you this afternoon. And I joined ICF about a year and a half ago after a long career in state government. Well, long to me, 9 years with the state of Colorado. I'm working primarily on housing programs, but that included CDBG. I also have a little bit of local government experience as well at the county level. And now I'm based in the Pacific Northwest where it's the sun wants to come out, but it's usually gray.
Great, thanks, Carrie. So I wanted to, before we jumped back into the material, I wanted to mention we had a question right before the end of our session about in the case where we had we were trying to talk about qualifying someone as a Section 3 worker and this issue about looking back, and we said that we would sort of verify this. So let me, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. That is not what I want. I think I will not share my screen, but I will simply, what I'm looking at is the regulations themselves. And so when you go to the regulations in the definitions, and so these are at, this is 24 CFR 75.5, and under the definition for Section 3 worker, the reason that we're a little limited on this sort of look back period on what we can do is that the language specifically says any worker who currently fits or when hired within the past 5 years fit at least one of the following categories. And of course, our first category is workers' income. So there was a question right before we ended our morning session about, if we had someone that was hired prior to the effective date of the new regulation, so prior to November 30th, 2020, if they were hired prior to that, we said, well, we can't look back prior to that effective date. So there was a question of, well, could I, if that person in November of 2020, if their current income actually would income qualify them, could I use that? So, we might have a worker that presently their salary they no longer would qualify because they've gotten some raises over time. And so unfortunately, the way the regulations are specifically written, we either can look at what their current salary is, so that fits with what the regulations talk about, currently fits, or we can only look back to when they were hired. It's within this 5-year period, and right now, because of our effective date being less than 5 years out, the furthest back we can look is November 30th of 2020. So for that worker that was hired prior to that, the only way that we can qualify them income-wise is to be able to look at their current salary. So I wanted to make sure that we followed up and answered that question before we dove further in to the materials. All right, so we're going to move into module 2. We spent the morning going through all those definitions and the specifics about how this was going to work. And now we're going to start talking about, okay, so how do I incorporate this into operating programs and dealing with individual projects, needing to understand how do we apply this. So as part of this, we're going to be talking about what DLG's requirements specifically are, including for the Section 3 plan, which is something that is part of the this last year's amended handbook. And then kind of talking through that process of when we're hiring eligible and qualified workers, what's our process going to be? What about working with contracting with businesses? How might we try to recruit workers, eligible workers and businesses? And then talking through specifically what kind of documentation, what kind of certification do we need to have in place as part of that? So hopefully this is okay. How does this actually work in the real world? So DLG requires each local community to adopt a Section 3 plan. And we're going to look at, there's a sample in the updated handbook we're going to look at in just a moment. And really what that Section 3 plan is doing is saying, these are the rules that we're going to follow. This is our protocol on this, and so we need to kind of talk about the logistics of that. That Section 3 plan is also oftentimes used as a way to communicate those requirements. So as I would think a lot of you are thinking about, we have to make sure that contractors, subcontractors, understand what it is that we're requiring them to do. How is this rule, for as much as you're learning how this rule is different, you've got other folks that are impacted by these changes that they need to have a basic understanding of this, and particularly where we get into roles and responsibilities. What does this mean with this new rule for that contractor? How does it change what they are doing under the new rule versus what we might have been asking them to do under the old Section 3 rule? So we're going to spend some time talking about that. And how we would implement that. And so I think the Section 3 plan can be a really important component on how do I actually communicate that. So the sample plan that's included in your DLG handbook is attachment 4-3. And that's where the minimal requirements are. But you as a local community may want to think about, how do I want to take that a little bit further so that I can use it as a way to communicate with folks. So the sample, and which sets the minimum standard, and 4-3 is the city or county is going to be agreeing to implement these Section 3 requirements. And so it lays out under the quantitative efforts, which is what we spent most of the morning talking about, the fact that you are going to actively work to implement the Section 3 plan, making sure that you are working towards meeting those goals on the 25 and 5% benchmarks that we've been talking about earlier. And the fact, reiterating again, it only covers housing rehabilitation, housing construction, and other public construction. And then luckily you have this threshold that it's only projects that are in excess of $200,000. And we spent quite a bit of time about that. So the goal that you are mandated to work towards is trying to have at least 25% of the labor hours be worked by Section 3 workers, and then 5% of those hours by qualifying targeted Section 3 workers. And so we're going to be talking not only about the implementation, but as I keep mentioning at the end of this, we're going to talk about the reporting. DLG, of course, is required to report to HUD, and so they're going to need you to collect and then report to them so that they will be able to meet those requirements. So the data that's going to be collected, and we'll look at the sample report form a little bit later, we're going to be collecting that information on what are the total labor hours for the project, and then the labor hours worked by each of our categories, our Section 3 and our targeted Section 3 workers. So we're essentially collecting what we need to make that calculation that we looked at the end of this morning's session. And then that Section 3 sample action plan also includes language about, you also agree to complete what we're going to call the qualitative efforts, which are really outreach efforts. So when there are opportunities for jobs training, for contracting opportunities, that you are making efforts to try to make sure that the folks that could qualify know about this, that you're trying to make those linkages. So we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about examples of those qualitative efforts. And keep in mind, as we talked about this morning, that in the absence of being able to meet those benchmarks, you still are able to be in compliance with the Section 3 rules if you have undertaken some of those qualitative efforts. So really important that everybody not only tries to hit the benchmarks for the 25 and 5%, but that everybody would be actively implementing some of those qualitative efforts. So if you miss on the quantitative goals, that you're still going to be okay, you're still going to be in compliance, because you're able to then certify, yes, we actually did these qualitative efforts. So take a look at what's in the handbook. It's posted on the DLG website, and that is an edition that was new for this year. But again, I think about that as a starting point, because I think you have some decisions to make and some things to think about. How am I actually going to incorporate this into running the program, and how do I communicate when this applies and those requirements? So I think a lot of folks in their Section 3 plans are kind of trying to think about making this as something user-friendly, that at least some part of that they could pull out and hand to or refer contractors, subcontractors to that Section 3 plan as a reference point on how this is going to work. So, we mentioned about the applicability is already laid out there. Maybe it needs some additional language to make it a little more user-friendly. We've identified the benchmarks as part of that. But then thinking about what are the recipient and contractor responsibilities. And we're going to talk a little bit more as we go along, particularly about, okay, how do we document compliance? What are our options on documenting a Section 3 worker? How do we qualify and document a targeted Section 3 worker or a Section 3 business concern? And so capturing some of that information and figuring out how do we best communicate that to the contractor that's going to be part of this project is we're going to spend some time in this section kind of talking about that. And I think the Section 3 plan might be one of the ways to incorporate some of that and use that as a way to communicate to those other partners. Also, those reporting deadlines, the complaint procedures, all of that could be incorporated into that Section 3 plan to give you a little bit more robust of a Section 3 plan than what the sample that's provided in the handbook. And that kind of would be then a reference point for not only internal on your staff, but then when you're trying to communicate with other partners about, hey, these are the rules that apply. And I think one of the things that I know we've talked about in some of the other sessions that Carrie and I and Andelin have done is wanting to make sure, there's a tendency anytime there's a new rule or an updated rule that, contractors may be kind of like, okay, that's like the last straw. I don't want to be bothered with this. And there's kind of an overreaction. And you sometimes lose valuable vendors who say, it's one more thing, I don't want to deal with that. So I think it's going to be really important for us to get the word out that, okay, yes, it's different, but in many ways, there are aspects of this that should be simpler for folks to be able to implement and make sure that folks are reacting based on an actual understanding of what those requirements are for that. So that's kind of one of our tasks on that. We'll be talking about some of the ways that you might accomplish that at the local level. So as part of having success with implementing that Section 3 plan and trying to meet those benchmarks, we need to try to do some recruitment and make sure that, if we've got Section 3 business concerns that might be able to participate in the project or programs that you're operating, to try to get the word out to folks. But also, if we've got contractors that are going to be hiring, that where there are prospective workers that could qualify as a Section 3 worker or a targeted worker, trying to figure out how do we establish those linkages so that the employer could identify where those folks were, that workers would know about those job opportunities, so that we can meet those goals. So some of the ways that we could do some of our outreach, our qualitative efforts on this, and just know that if and this note at the bottom here, 7515 is for PHAs, but for HCD, for CDBG folks, the regulations, if you look at 75.25, it's going to call out this list of qualitative efforts that we're going to be talking about today. And note that that's not an all-exclusive list, that there are no other outreach efforts that would make sense. And so even on the reporting to HUD, there's sort of an other category that could be collected. But things that might be done as part of that. You could, we're going to be talking about, HUD has an opportunity portal. So you could have your contractors and subcontractors list all of their employment opportunities on that opportunity portal. So that would be a way of being able to document and say, hey, we did appropriate outreach to try to match potential workers with job opportunities. We might be building relationships with, in some cases, I would guess that you've got some jobs, training centers, technical schools, other programs, local programs that are working with individuals that might qualify as Section 3 and targeted Section 3 workers. So building those relationships where you're communicating that information, so you have a way of letting those partners know about those opportunities. They can use their network and be able to post that information. All of that qualifies as a qualitative effort. You could be using your agency or your organization's website as a way to be able to post those opportunities. We also do, with our citizen participation, we sometimes also post notices in public areas. That would be another way to do some qualitative outreach on that. And some of those things may be much more simple on site. For instance, if we have a project where a contractor is anticipating some hiring, they could do a job fair right in that neighborhood. Maybe there's a community center. We post information about the fact that there are some job opportunities, and they have a job fair right there in the community where a resident doesn't need to, travel to that contractor's offices, which might be in the next county or two, but they could right there be able to come in, put in an application, have a job interview. That would all count as a qualitative effort, and that would be a way then to network to get that information out. You may also be doing some things, and we've talked with a number of communities who said, we're going to do some sort of meet and greet sessions with inviting all of their contractors and subs to come to a quick session, have a quick overview of the new Section 3 rules, maybe giving them copies of the Section 3 plan, any other information that would be helpful. We're going to be talking about sample forms that could be used to be able to document a Section 3 business concern. And so trying to get the word out, those would all count as qualitative efforts that you could be undertaken, and would not only further your efforts to meet those benchmarks, but it would also then count. You could document that in your file as part of your qualitative efforts. That's sort of your backup plan on meeting those safe harbor compliance requirements. So we have some specific ways that we're able to document eligibility for workers, and we're going to go through those. And so as part of that Section 3 plan and thinking about implementation, it's thinking about what forms are we going to use. We're going to provide you some examples on this. But as we were talking about this morning, how that documentation is going to be done. I think with this flexibility about looking at the individual income, wages, if it was annualized for that worker, and being able to qualify that in that way, I suspect we will have many more of these where the employer will simply provide verification of these are my total labor hours, this is my qualifying workers based on their salary, with some additional information about based on that that worker's residency or perhaps youth build participation, that we would be able to document those as our Section 3 and targeted Section 3 workers. So that some discussions, I think, up front about, so is this something that we're going to be going to individual workers, asking them to fill out documents? What's our methodology going to be on this? So having those partners understand what the options are, what the process would be, becomes pretty important. So we mentioned the opportunity portal, and we've got the web address down here at the bottom of the slide. I would think in some communities, you're going to look at that and you're going to see nobody registered. And so this might be something that would be built out over time. But it also may be a good starting point to be checking that when you are soliciting bidders on projects. And as I mentioned, you could make it a requirement that your contractors, as part of being awarded KCDBG funds, or their subcontractors, could be required to register in the opportunity portal when they have jobs and training or subcontracting opportunities. And that would not only help build that opportunity portal out, but it's also going to qualify as a qualitative effort, which you would be doing on that. So this would allow workers to be able to post information about themselves, post resumes, so that they could search for opportunities, but they could also post their own availability. So if we have a contractor that's going to be hiring, they could use the opportunity portal to see if there were workers in that area and solicit from them an application. And for Section 3 business concerns, this would be a way for you to post that there were, opportunities and also contact information about, if you want to, get the bid packet, if you want the form from us to be able to document qualifying as a Section 3 business concern, all those resources can be used through the opportunity portal. This is sort of a networking, like matchmaking opportunity for you. All right, so let's get down to the details on when we're qualifying. We're going to start with Section 3 workers. So we have a number of options on this, and you'll see the first two these could be coming from the worker. So you could use a self-certification form that worker filled out, much like we do with regular economic development projects, where they're going to indicate, yes, my income is at or below this this amount, and that self-certification could be dropped in the file. You are not required to have backup documentation. You're not required to go through that, full process like you might for other activities. So that self-certification is an option. Since that worker could also qualify just based on the fact that they are receiving assistance through a means-based program like public housing or Section 8 assistance, they could provide a self-certification verifying that they already have been found eligible to qualify for public housing or Section 8 assisted housing. That would be documentation that would be available for you. You could go to the PHA. or the owner of the property where they are residing, and they could verify the fact that they are receiving assistance. If you had, the administrator who was providing vouchers, assistance, that could also be a source for that. But I think this fourth bullet down is probably going to be where we see a lot of this coming from, the documentation, is that the employer themselves could simply document that this is an income eligible worker based on their wage rate and having annualized that. So, I would think on a lot of our DLG funded projects, you're already going to be triggering Davis-Bacon. So you're already getting certified payrolls that kind of give you backup documentation on the number of hours worked by employees. And so you could, on the front end of a project, say, okay, this is our definition of a Section 3 worker, and the employer could be asked to certify which of their workers are qualifying as Section 3 workers. If there are new hires along the way, they could add to that. And then over time, we would be tracking, okay, I have 10 qualifying employees. I'm going to be reporting semi-annually here. These are the number of qualifying hours that those workers have worked. And so that would give you that documentation. And the documentation can come from the employer. It could be from an electronic payroll system that's able to document that, or it simply could be a statement that they're going to provide for you. So we have some flexibility for that. And then the other opportunity here is that we could have a worker that is employed by a Section 3 business concern. So we said that, if we have a Section 3 business concern, that automatically their workforce qualifies not only as a Section 3 worker, but also as a targeted Section 3 worker. So that's sort of that magic category where suddenly that employer would simply be able to give you a statement of, here are all the hours that have been worked. These workers are employed by a Section 3 business concern, which are going to have that certification in your files, and we'd be able to count all of those hours. So at the end of the day, in the backup files, we're going to expect to see that one of these forms of documentation is going to be contained in that file. So that's our Section 3 workers. For our targeted Section 3 workers, and you'll notice we have this sort of icon in the top right corner. That's because we are talking about the subpart C definition for HCD assistance. We mentioned this morning that if you had a project that included public housing assistance, this is one of those areas where there's a different definition. So we're only going to be talking about the HCD assistance definition because that's predominantly what folks are going to be dealing with. So Andelin went over this morning, we talked about that fact that to be a targeted Section 3 worker, it's going to be based on where that worker's residence is and then whether it's within that service area. And so it might be a 1 mile radius, but we talked about, in a lot of our projects being in non-urban rural areas, that service area might be set, quite a bit larger. And so if that worker's address is within our service area that we've designated, that they will then also qualify as a targeted Section 3 worker. Our other options on this, if we have a Section 3 business concern, then all of their employees can be counted as targeted Section 3 workers. And also, if we have certification that they were had been a youth build participant, they came directly from youth build, we would also be able to count them. And I don't know, I know in Ohio, where I worked, there were only a couple of youth build programs, and I think there used to be more at one point. So whether that's going to be an option for folks or not, but that might be something to explore. Are there any youth build programs in the state, in the area. Maybe some outreach would be done to the, if you find that there's a youth build program, that would be a great way to do some qualitative efforts to try to bring some of those folks into the program. And keep in mind, so if they hire a youth build participant, that employer is then going to be able to count them for up to 5 years going forward. So that could be really helpful. All right, so I wanted to switch gears a little bit. We've talked about, how we qualify folks, but then thinking about, what are some of the ways that we might be able to, help make those linkages. So, first off, I think we need to figure out a way to communicate this information to our potential partners so they understand, who would qualify as a Section 3 business concern. What would the documentation be that would be needed? And we're going to show you later a sample tool that HUD has provided that you're welcome to modify as you want, but we went through the criteria for a Section 3 business concern, looking at the ownership and control being either an LMI individual with at least 51% ownership and day-to-day control, or a public housing or Section 8 housing recipient. But the other part of that then were business concerns that at least 75% of their workers' hours in the last 3 months were completed by workers that qualified as Section 3 workers. So on the front end, we not only could be doing some outreach, seeking out Section 3 business concerns, but then beginning to qualify those and maybe walking them through. What is it that we need from you to be able to make that designation? And we talked about the opportunity portal. I've heard some communities saying, well, we wonder if some of our minority and women-owned businesses, which tended to be smaller, might they also qualify as a Section 3 business concern? So we might be able to use some of the existing resources and networks that you already have in place. So when we talk about capacity building might be part of this. So, making sure that where we have potential partners that they understand what those requirements are. In some cases, we might have Section 3 business concerns that need some hand-holding, a little bit of coaching on, how to get bonding, or, how to identify projects that are eligible. And so anything that we can do to try to help educate would be important on that. We have some communities talking about they're working directly with the unions in their area, and because they have apprenticeship programs, other training programs, that might be a way to not only create some opportunities within the union, but also identify some positions that would qualify as a Section 3 or targeted Section 3 worker as part of this. And then this is the Section 3 business registry, which allows a Section 3 business concern to register. Now, keep in mind, this is a resource where you could look to see, are there any Section 3 business concerns that have registered, and be able to use that. But you still need to have the documentation. The fact that they're registered here doesn't give you the documentation you need for your files to show them as a qualifying Section 3 business concern. So you're still going to need to have them fill out information so that you have that documentation in place. All right, so let's revisit. I think we looked at this earlier, but this is kind of coming down to, okay, how will we actually certify Section 3 business concerns? So we've talked about these three options, and so we would need to get certification from that business, and we have a sample at the end here. We've got a sample certification form that can be used for that. One of the things I wanted to point out here, so when we talk about this 75% of labor hours performed by the business over the last 3 months, so this is taking a snapshot in time of this business to be able to document what seems to be typical for them and qualifying them as a Section 3 business concern. This is not your project. This is not a specific project. It's just looking overall at the labor hours that were performed over the last 3 months, and were they at or above 75% of those would be qualifying. And so businesses are going to need to understand what that requirement would be. They may be able to say right from the beginning, knowing once they know those requirements, that I know by definition we're not going to meet that, or oh, this might work, and need to go through that process on that. And then of course, the other two keys here are related to ownership, and that would be a question that could be answered relatively quickly, hopefully. All right, so in certifying, the business is able to do a self-certification. You're not required to have full documentation on that, but we're going to want to collect that up front as part of our bid packet. So it's not that they're required to qualify as a Section 3 business concern, but as part of your bid packet, I think you would want to ask them, can you qualify as a Section 3 business concern? Here's our certification form, and we would ask that that be submitted during that bidding process. And then you would be verifying that before you awarded that contract. That would then start you from the beginning of that project knowing, okay, for all of the labor hours worked by this Section 3 business concern, we're going to be able to collect total labor hours and count those in those categories. And that Section 3 business concern qualification can remain in place as long as they continue to meet that definition. So hopefully we will have some businesses that realize it's to our benefit to qualify as a Section 3 business concern based on our workforce and maintain that, so that, because that's giving them potentially an advantage in procurement processes. And just keep in mind that you are not required, as we mentioned, to have that backup documentation in place, but the business concern would be responsible for maintaining those records that would be needed to be able to document that, yes, I actually met those requirements. All right, so you also will need, and this is probably not unexpected, so DLG will be including language in your agreements that will require that this is, you need to follow the Section 3 requirements, and you're going to, as you did under the old rule, need to pass on those requirements to subrecipients, contractors, subcontractors, and so your contracts would need to include those. And since we also need to have those qualitative actions taken, that language would need to be included also in that contract language. And we're working on updating the contract guide to give you sample language for that. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about, as we finish up this section, in talking about how we might work with contractors to try to make sure that they understand the Section 3 requirements and maybe encourage them on being able to help you. So, some of you, I would think, when you have more complex projects, are requiring that there be a pre-bidder conference, that they have to attend that. And that's where you are, getting pertinent information out about that bid packet, maybe the complexity of that scope of work. So you make sure that everybody understands those specifics. One thing that you could choose to do, particularly in this, I guess I would call it a transition period, where everyone's kind of learning, oh, we've got a new version of the Section 3 rule. you could choose to require a pre-bidder conference, and as part of that, not only go through, some of the specifics about the project, maybe, fact that it's a Davis-Bacon project, but also walking them through, okay, got a new Section 3 rule. This is going to be what the procedure is, and that may help kind of allay some of those fears about, well, I've heard there's a change to Section 3. That might be a way to get some of that communication out. Also, I think almost all of you would be doing a meeting, a kickoff at the point that you were a pre-construction conference before you started the work. And again, I think even if you did that pre-bid conference, I would want to, at the beginning of that, once a contract had been awarded, wanting to go back through the details about roles and responsibility, the fact that they need to be, collecting this information about total labor hours, about qualifying workers and those hours that are being worked. That process can start with the contract award and in your bid proposals. So you could be identifying in that bid packet that it's a Section 3 project, listing out those requirements that you're going to need them to provide total labor hours, these qualifying worker hours, and you could be asking them as part of that bid submission that they're going to put in to not only identify if they're a Section 3 business concern, but you might be asking them, what do you project the total labor hours to be for this project with your existing workforce? Do you have workers that are going to qualify based on this criteria, based on either their current wage or when they were hired, which we've kind of gone through? So you begin to collect that as part of the bid packet process, and then begin to verify that at the point that you award that contract. So, maybe at the point we award the contract, we ask them to provide us a list of their employees and existing wage rates to be able to determine how many workers on your workforce currently qualify, and also your contract language might, well, it's going to include language about these qualitative efforts. So talking with them prior to execution about, okay, you've identified as part of your bid packet, you expect to have a certain number of subcontractors, you expect to create some additional jobs, talking through that process that they're going to undertake to make sure that those qualitative efforts have been completed. These are all things that we can kind of begin to incorporate into our standard processes that we're already undertaking to try to help with the implementation of the Section 3 rule and help our projects moving towards meeting those benchmark requirements. So ways that we can do that, we've talked about, your policies and procedures, any information that you can provide that's user-friendly to contractors and other partners, identifying what those goals are, when you need things from them, what form you would ask them to provide. And then, we talked about these sort of outreach efforts, the linkages that you're using, whether you're going to ask folks to register or use the opportunity portal, all of that would be communicated and started at that early point. In some cases, as I mentioned, you might have a workforce development offices or other partners in that community that could participate in trying to identify both businesses and workers and get the word out to them, that sort of matchmaking process. And all of that would be something that then could be recorded as being part of your qualitative efforts. All right, so that kind of handles our planning and implementation. Carrie, are there any questions you think we need to hit now, or can we go ahead into Module 3 and then address them as part of our Q&A?
I think there were a couple that are just, I think, real quick points of clarification.
Perfect.
So one was, how can we show qualitative efforts for a project that does not meet the Section 3 benchmarks if they are not anticipating hiring for the project?
So it's not only hiring, but it would also be those efforts to, recruit Section 3 business concerns. It's those creating those linkages with, might be that we've required our businesses to register our contractors if they were going to have jobs and training opportunities, also subcontracting opportunities requiring them to post. You could be using those some of those resources to post where you anticipated a Section 3 project to be going forward in a community. So I think those are all ways to be able to document, I've done some outreach, even though we may not expect jobs to be created. A lot of these projects, contractors don't necessarily hire additional staff, but they oftentimes would be then subcontracting out some part of what they're doing. And so there still would be some outreach efforts that could qualify towards meeting that requirement.
Yeah, I think it's an important shift, mental shift to, the new rule is not all about hiring, right? The
Yes.
old rule was very focused on new positions, but this rule is about who's actually working on the project, and it's not necessarily about new hires. And then we got a couple questions, I think, that also kind of relate in some ways about Davis-Bacon, and wouldn't Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements make the Section 3 requirements moot if people are earning, those prevailing wages? Will they not be considered low income? And then there was another, well, let's do that one first.
So, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. And we've certainly heard people across the country say, okay, I don't think this is going to work because all my projects are Davis-Bacon. Now, there are opportunities where we've got apprenticeship or other starting positions that sometimes we're going to have positions that will qualify. But DLG and you as recipients of DLG's CDBG funds are required to show that you're making your best efforts to be able to implement the Section 3 goals. So you would still be, when there's an opportunity, you would be seeing if you could document this, if there were qualifying positions. In the absence of that, then we're going to have completed our qualitative efforts. We still will be in compliance, but we need to incorporate Section 3 into our process.
Right. And I'll just add that it's also not, we're not doing an income verification for workers on these projects, right? It's not, you're not looking at backup documentation, you're not projecting forward a year. You're looking at when they were hired or when you were qualifying them for this at the beginning of the project. So if you're looking at when they were hired, Davis-Bacon may not be a concern, right? If they were hired last fall, and we're low income at the time, then you can count them for 5 years from that point.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there was one other one, but I think we can move on just to make sure we have enough time to get through everything, and we can come back to that one.
Let's do that.
So, do I have the ball? There we go. Okay, so we're moving on to Module 3, which is largely about program oversight. So how do we monitor and make sure that what needs to be happening is happening for Section 3 compliance? So we'll review best practices for Section 3 program oversight, when and why HUD may conduct a compliance review, and we'll talk about some of the information that they would be looking for. Record keeping requirements, and then also we'll talk a little bit more about Section 3 complaints. Your keys to success in this module in program oversight. So you want to make sure, of course, that you make the best effort to ensure that safe harbor provisions and certification requirements are met to the greatest extent feasible. That's a key caveat, right? We're trying our hardest. Make sure that you have Section 3 requirements accurately reflected in your written agreements, contracts, subcontracts. So obviously those are your binding legal agreements, and that's how you can hold your partner's feet to the fire to ensure compliance with Section 3. And we've talked a little bit about this, Les talked about it as well, but I, may have seen this in my time in state government, that sometimes requirements were just buried in a contract. But you want to make sure, especially while this is new, this is something that you're communicating outside of the contract as well. Provide support to your subrecipients and partners to achieve compliance. Of course, monitoring compliance. So have a process in place to verify that your subrecipients, contractors, subcontractors are doing what they agreed to in the written agreement. And then if they are not, you need to take action to correct noncompliance. Once you uncover an issue, that's only half the battle. You have to then fix it. And then finally, communication about responsibilities and record keeping. As far as HUD is concerned, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you want to make sure that you're really clear up front about the record keeping requirements so that you're not, scrambling at the end to recreate information. Okay, so let's talk about, what might trigger a monitoring review. So DLG and its partners and subrecipients should develop a process to determine how often they'll monitor contractors and subcontractors. And in what manner. Is that on-site? Is it a desk review? A combination of the two? And those criteria should result in higher risk contractors or subs being monitored more frequently. So risk-based criteria are listed here. That could be the number of complaints that DLG or the local government has received. Maybe evidence or indication of potential non-compliance from reports that you're getting. So maybe reports are regularly incomplete or inaccurate. That could be a sign of risk. The contractor's need for technical assistance, if they're submitting those reports incorrectly or trying to help them and it's still just not getting through, then that could also be a sign that maybe you need to monitor. And then of course, projects that include a large amount of funding, more money always means more risk. And then while this rule is newer, you might want to practice greater oversight. So look more closely and more frequently at what your partners are doing. And then as people integrate these new requirements into their processes and you have a sense of who does it well and who struggles, maybe you can relax a little bit on the oversight of those that you see are getting it and doing it well. And then if you do find non-compliance issues, a best practice, as we talked about, you need to fix it. So something you could do is develop and follow a corrective action plan to get back on track. So what do we need to do and by when, typically, and maybe who's going to do it as well. So a best practice for DLG and its local government partners is to develop procedures and implement a process for tracking subrecipient, contractor, and subcontractor compliance. So tracking isn't required, but it does allow you to quickly identify and resolve issues of noncompliance when they occur and allows you to evaluate program performance and make changes. I will say it's not required by HUD necessarily. So one procedure that could be implemented to assist with tracking is requiring partners to submit reports on an established time frame. So it's probably something that's already happening, right? You could include, say, in your Section 3 plan that reports will be submitted on a weekly, monthly, or quarterly basis. You may already have an ongoing reporting process. So if you're already collecting information to report to DLG on a periodic basis or just collecting it yourself, Section 3 could be incorporated into that process. And then for Davis-Bacon projects, that could even be weekly, right? Payrolls are weekly, and we'll talk about streamlining Davis-Bacon and Section 3 tracking on the next slide. Okay, so I think this was part of the thought behind using labor hours was to align Section 3 reporting with Davis-Bacon. And of course, that's when the threshold and criteria for both apply. So you can use certified submissions to track total labor hours, Section 3 labor hours, and targeted Section 3 labor hours, right? The information on who's working what hours is all there. You just need to make sure you identify up front who the Section 3 business concerns are, who are the Section 3 workers, and targeted Section 3 workers. And then, of course, just as a reminder, the wage determination that will apply should be determined prior to contracting. And that's something that you get from the Department of Labor site, which I believe now isn't exclusive to them, but the wage decisions are on sam.gov. Okay, so if HUD is coming to review DLG and its projects, local governments may be a part of that if a project of theirs is included in that HUD monitoring. So they can result from several sources, kind of similar to DLG and local governments. There's a risk-based process for HUD. So HUD's looking for the same red flags that recipients and subrecipients keep an eye out for with contractors. So those could be complaints that imply systemic problems, evidence of potential noncompliance during routine monitoring, and maybe indications of noncompliance found in required reports. So, if compliance is risk-based, maybe because HUD received complaints about the Section 3 recipient or the project, how did they get those? So we just wanted to make sure to cover this. So as Les mentioned, the Section 3 plan may include a process to accept complaints at the state government and local government level, but HUD can also accept complaints. So that process has changed a little bit with the new rule because oversight of Section 3 has changed to program specific within HUD's office. It used to be fair housing and equal opportunity, and now it's switched to the program office. So the field rep that oversees the CDBG program would likely be the one to be overseeing this. So any complaints submitted to HUD would be routed to the program office in the field. Other things that might trigger a review, maybe nothing, it might be random. It could be initiated before funding is awarded, based on the nature of the project or activity, maybe it's more risky. It can also just be geographically dispersed. HUD be looking for a representative sample of the extent to which various program participants are complying with the regulatory guidance. And that'll also inform HUD's updates to the benchmarks in Section 3 rule. So they need to get a good sample across the country of how Section 3 compliance is going. Okay, so this slide is about reporting and record keeping related to compliance reviews, and we'll dig in more on other reporting requirements in the next and final module. So the final rule requires that HUD has access to all records, reports, and other documents of the Section 3 recipient, that's DLG. So those need to be maintained to demonstrate compliance with the Section 3 requirements. Or those that are maintained in accordance with the regulations governing the specific HUD program that is triggering Section 3. So in this case, CDBG. DLG and its partners have to maintain documentation or ensure that documentation is maintained to show that workers meet the Section 3 or targeted Section 3 requirements at the time of hire or the first reporting period. So if we're claiming people, we have to have documentation that shows that. And then it needs to be maintained for the time period required for record retention according to the program. So follow the provisions in your written agreement for Section 3 records as well as other project records. That should already be there, and the same requirements apply. And then just keep in mind, we've talked about this a little bit already. There have been questions on it, but contractors and subs and thus, recipients and subrecipients can report on Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers for up to 5 years from when their certification as a Section 3 worker or targeted worker is established. And that runs as long as the worker is employed with the same employer. So that person may, come in low income. Within 2 years, they're killing it. They're doing great, moving up, getting raises, and maybe they're not low income anymore. But you can still count them for the full 5 years after they were hired. And that's the point, right, of Section 3 is to provide economic opportunities. Okay, so the types of records to maintain include the total labor hours worked by all workers, the total labor hours worked by Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers. Other records you want to keep include documentation of contracts and subcontracts awarded to businesses that provide employment training opportunities to Section 3 workers, and that's in accordance with the prioritization requirements. So that could be in your written agreements. You also want to maintain points in the process where Section 3 requirements and efforts and achievements are communicated. So how are you communicating these requirements to your partners? That could be in your in application templates or project submissions, maybe on DLG's part, and then bid and proposal solicitations and responses, as well as reports from partners. You also want to maintain documentation to support the qualitative efforts that were made to meet the requirements, right? So if we don't meet the benchmarks, then we have this second tier of a way to achieve compliance, and that's by these qualitative efforts. So, any training provided to partners, other guidance, there's a number there in the regulation, and I think we'll show one of the reporting screens that lists some of the qualitative efforts as well. But there are many options you have, that I think we've talked about already, but you want to maintain documentation that you tried, because if you, don't meet the benchmarks and then DLG checks some boxes in the reporting field on qualitative efforts, you have to be able to back that up, right? If it's not documented, it didn't happen. And then lastly, of course, you want to maintain your Section 3 worker, targeted Section 3 worker, and business certification documents. Okay, so that was a very quick module 3, and now we're going to pause for a knowledge check and some Q&A.
Great. All right. So we've got a couple of questions. Knowledge checks are going to pop up here. So our first question, and this is again a true or false question. I'm going to shut down a couple boxes on my screen so that they will be visible. Give us just a moment here. There we go. So first question, and this is true or false. Low and very low income limits are determined annually by HUD, and for the purposes of Section 3 are typically established at 80% and 50% of area median household income. And this is a little bit of a trick question, so look at that a little carefully. All right, so the poll has ended. Let's see how you did on this. All right, so some folks got caught on this one, and understandably so. So this is false, and the reason it's false is that this is referencing household income. And as we said for Section 3, this is different than we deal with really on anything else, that it was specifically called out as individual income. And that was really to create the ability for, I think, to allow the employer to be able to then qualify workers based on the wage rate that they were being paid. I think this lines up a little bit, as Carrie said, with Davis-Bacon. And so in this case, we are only looking at the wage rate for that individual. We're not trying to track, is this in the context of it's a household of 10 people, or there is other income? We simply are tracking that individual's income to then determine whether they qualify as a Section 3 worker. And that is one of the key flexibilities here, which I think sort of simplifies potentially the ability to document things. All right, our next question. Do the benchmarks requirements only apply towards new hires? Yes or no? All right, so the majority of you got this right. This is one of the biggest key items here. So this is the big change between the old Section 3 rule and the new Section 3 rule, that we're looking at that overall workforce. So it's not just the new hires, it's that overall workforce. So we mentioned we could have folks that we could look back at their wages from when they first were hired, if it was within 5 years and after our effective date of the new Section 3 rule. So it's not just new hires, but it's essentially giving credit for, I have a workforce that includes folks that either currently still qualify, or when I hired them, they qualify, but now they've been with me for a while, their income has increased, but because I brought in someone and have kept them as part of the workforce and sustained that. So we're looking at the overall workforce, we're looking at total labor hours and total qualifying worker hours, whether they are new hires or not. Really important point. All right, our next question. HUD will review and update the benchmarks by Federal Register notice no less frequently than once every 3 years, every year, every 3 years, or every 10 years. All right, so most folks got this right. It's every 3 years at a minimum. They could choose to do this more frequently. This is also really sort of an important change on this. So, and we're used to, like, for instance, Davis-Bacon, that threshold of $2,000 has been in place for my entire working career, which, folks look at and say, that really ought to have been adjusted over time. So when these regulations were written, they wrote in a process to be able to evaluate this and tweak this over time. And so it's interesting because, and I think Andelin covered this morning, but the implication of this could be rather large. So the regulations allow them to do a simple single benchmark across the country. So right now, everybody is dealing with 25 and 5% for all projects that are triggering. They have the ability under the notice to be able to establish multiple benchmarks. So that could be based on the kind of project or based on a regional basis on that. And so these notices, these future notices, are going to be based on aggregate data that they've been collecting on this. And so I think the hope here is that, some of you are raising really good points of, all of my projects are Davis-Bacon. Those workers by definition are not going to qualify for this. So I guess my hope is that as the data is being collected. And you can see that folks are complying with the goals and the required steps for Section 3, but we have types of projects or regions where it's really not feasible to be able to meet these requirements. My hope is that they will be tweaked over time so that maybe projects or regions where this isn't realistic, that maybe there's some changes made to that. So it's really, over time, this could be an incredibly important inclusion in how these regulations were written. All right, and then our final knowledge check question here. Section 3 is subordinate to all other existing federal, state, local laws and regulations. Is that true or false? So this is true. It is subordinate to that overlay of state, federal, local laws and regulations. And so that's why I think this morning we mentioned a couple times, we use that statement of to the greatest extent feasible, because there are perhaps restrictions based on federal, state, local laws and regulations on what you could do to promote Section 3. So for instance, you are required to follow the state procurement requirements. And so you would need to follow those. So Section 3 wouldn't allow you to do something different as part of your procurement process. All right, so let's move into our Q&A. And last time I looked, we had a couple of here that I thought probably made sense to talk about. Some of these I think have, well, Vonda had a question which I thought was kind of perfect with this relating to the overlay of other federal, state requirements. So this question about will an employer need to have permission from the employee to provide their income information to a third party? There's nothing in the Section 3 requirements that addresses that, but if you've got local, state, or federal requirements that restrict you on being able to do that, then you would have to follow that. You're already, for Davis-Bacon projects, providing certified payrolls, and I don't know that there's a requirement that the employer has to go to the employees and get their permission to be able to release that information. So I'm thinking that the employer already has the authorization to be able to provide those numbers. Now, whether there are issues about privacy and the name and address of that employee, that may be an issue. And we're going to be showing there are sample forms on being able to qualify workers. And so I suppose you could do a combination where you had a worker form that documented that they were, certifying as qualified. When we get to targeted worker, we're looking at their residence. And so we might combine that with some language about being able to report their hours towards the Section 3 compliance. Carrie, anything you want to add to that one?
I was looking at another one, so sorry if I missed a little bit of what you said, but I would just add also that you don't necessarily have to get their exact income, right? You just could state, here's the 80% income limit, they're over or not, right? If they qualify, they're under that, check the box. So you don't have to provide the level of specificity of exactly what they are earning.
And I kind of envision and that a lot of folks, particularly since I think the majority of our projects will trigger Davis-Bacon, I would think a lot of the work will be done on the front end on saying, okay, this is my workforce. These are my qualifying workers. So seems like first step, looking at current wages, how many workers do I have that qualify? And that could be, I would think, done with an employee ID, rather than having any personally identified information in that. I think you'd still have to have backup documentation in your files. But then, so, first we have income that qualifies. We also would be asking that question about, okay, do we have workers that were hired on or after November 30th, 2020, that the rate of pay when they first were hired would qualify? And so, that gives us another list of employees that could be qualifying. And then we overlay that with the question about their residency and whether they are qualifying as targeted Section 3 workers. Questions about, do we have anybody that's going to qualify as a youth build participant, and having that documentation in place. But I think on the front end, you would be documenting, okay, here's our workforce, here are the workers that qualify. Now we're, over time as this project goes on, begin to tabulate, okay, of my 10 workers that qualified as Section 3 workers, this payroll or this quarter or this 6 months, they've worked this number of hours, and begin to accrue that information over time. There was a question which I think we already answered, but I'll just mention it again. So the question about, should we be using federal prevailing wages when determining Section 3 qualifications? Should we use what the employee is going to be paid for Davis-Bacon, or if Davis-Bacon wasn't in play? So we're looking at, for these projects, we're looking at what their actual pay is for this particular project. And that really links us back to particularly if we've got a Davis-Bacon wage rate, we've got certified payrolls listing out, these are all the workers that have worked, these are their wage rates that they were being paid. So we kind of have the information to be able to verify if we wanted to go back and check what was being reported by the employer. We'd have some way of looking back at that. So it is going to be based on what they actually are being paid for this project. So that gets us through the existing question and answers. I'm going to suggest we jump into our last module, and then we will have an opportunity for some additional question and answers at the end of this section. So Carrie, I'll turn things back over to you.
Sure. And I'll add, I answered one question in the box, and this has come up before, are individual income limits something special and separate from the income limits we're familiar with? And you just use the one person household size of the Section 8 income limits. And I posted the link. Okay, so we are in the home stretch, and in this last module, we're going to talk about Section 3 reporting and evaluation. So our learning objectives for this section are to understand the reporting responsibilities of recipient agencies and how those trickle down to their partners, systems that you can use for reporting Section 3 activities and efforts, and then also the timeline for reporting and the information that needs to be provided. So what are we reporting on? Across all programs that trigger Section 3, we're really collecting the same information across programs and activities, but how it's reported to HUD varies depending on the system used. So for CDBG, regular CDBG, that system is IDIS, which DLG will be using, and I think I'll talk largely about we'll show some screens and things that really apply to DLG, but it's helpful, I think, for DLG's partners to see what where they need to put the information. So data fields to report on, these aren't going to be surprising, include Section 3 labor hours, targeted Section 3 labor hours, and the total labor hours. So that's how you do that math problem. And then, of course, the nature of recipients' efforts, so those qualitative efforts, and then a Section 3 compliance summary. Things to keep in mind when reporting. So this is a key caveat is employers who don't track labor hours in detail through a time and attendance system don't have to establish one just for Section 3. So they can provide a good faith assessment of labor hours for full-time or part-time employees. So they don't have to track them to the hour if they don't do that already. And then Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 worker hours, again, may be counted for up to 5 years from when their status as a Section 3 worker or targeted Section 3 worker is established. So I've already said it, but I'll say it again. If someone was hired in December 2020 at a low income wage, and they've since grown in that position, and they're now earning above 80% AMI, they still count as a Section 3 worker, and that's awesome because they experienced upward mobility as a result of this job. Okay, so HUD had to think carefully about how to handle the transition from the old Section 3 rule to the new Section 3 rule. So these are the requirements they put in place. So first, legacy projects are contracts that were executed or projects where funds were committed before November 30th, 2020. And those projects are still required to adhere to the old rule. And I don't know if Les has said it, but the way I've put it in a lot of these trainings is, November 30th, 2020 is the beginning of time as far as the new Section 3 rule is concerned. So they're following the requirements of the old rule. Recipients of that assistance have to still maintain records of Section 3 compliance under the old regulations, but they're no longer required to report in SPEARS, which was the old Section 3 reporting system. And though recipients don't have to report, they still have to maintain records that can demonstrate compliance with the old rule, plus any efforts made. So keep that documentation for the required period in case you're monitored. So then we have the transition period. The final rule was effective November 30th, 2020, but full compliance was required as of July 1st, 2021. I can't believe it's almost been a year. So for those projects, HUD expected them to follow the final rules requirements for new grants, commitments, and contracts. And recipients are required to maintain records of statutory, regulatory, and contractual compliance, but they weren't required to report to HUD during the transition period. And then we've mentioned that, the new rule has program-specific oversight, so the various program offices in HUD have been issuing guidance about how they want to handle transition projects, and the CDBG office published a notice that provided just that and said that they would require grantees to report for open activities starting July 1st, 2021. So if it was executed December 30th, 2020, didn't have to report on it until July 1st, 2021, but then IDIS or DRGR, if it's a special, disaster-related activity under CDBG, then those systems are used to report. Okay, so over the next few slides, as I mentioned, we'll talk about DLG's responsibilities to report to HUD. So for regular CDBG programs, Section 3 compliance is reported in the IDIS system. And then disaster recovery and grant reporting, or DRGR, for, as I mentioned, disaster recovery and other specialized CDBG programs. And then another thing to note is that reporting also gets rolled up into the state's annual Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report, or CAPER, which is one of the best acronyms at HUD. And that will include Section 3 compliance information entered into IDIS at the activity level, and then it'll get rolled up into that annual performance report. DLG, the state of Kentucky, has a new CDBG DR allocation. So for those funds, Section 3 reporting will go on the performance report for DRGR. And based on program requirements for each program and activity, those were effective July 1st of last year, as we just mentioned. And the intent here of folding in reporting into existing reporting systems is, again, to streamline. DLG no longer has to separately report in another system that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. I don't know about your experience. Mine in Colorado was sketchy. But the intent is to streamline reporting. So you're closing out an activity, you're doing the Section 3 reporting there as well. Okay, so here we have some screenshots. So these are probably mostly just viewed by DLG staff. But on this screen, just above where the highlight is where DLG will indicate if this activity is subject to Section 3. So remember, to be subject to Section 3, the activity has to be one that triggers it, and then you have that threshold. So if it was a straight, say, housing acquisition activity and there wasn't any construction, Section 3 wouldn't apply because there's no construction activity. We also had some questions about single family rehab programs where, the activity may exceed 200,000, but no single home would exceed or even come close to that threshold. So remember the definition of a Section 3 project, that it has to be under common ownership, management, and financing. So those kinds of scattered site projects where you have multiple owners involved wouldn't meet that threshold because of the ownership component. And so this is where DLG would indicate that Section 3 doesn't apply. Okay, and then here you have the spot where DLG enters the labor hours information. So total labor hours, it's at the bottom here, Section 3 targeted worker hours and Section 3 worker hours, and the system does the math for you and tells you, okay, are you hitting your 5% and 25% benchmarks? Yes or no? And from what I've seen, if those benchmarks are met, the nature of agency efforts section just disappears and goes away. So if those benchmarks are hit, it's not required to report on qualitative efforts for that project. But if they're not, then here you have the nature of agency efforts screen, and it's really just a checkbox. So, we mentioned what some of these efforts might look like. It could be outreach to generate job applicants who would be Section 3 worker or targeted Section 3 worker eligible, on the job training, outreach to try to secure bids from Section 3 business concerns, etc. So this is where you indicate the qualitative efforts, and of course, you have to have documentation to support any qualitative efforts that you claim. Okay. And then, is this you, Les? I think
it is, but you can
think it's back to you.
take it if you want.
I'll let you pick it up from here.
All right. So Carrie's led you through what the state has to report, and I think it's always helpful. Why are they asking me to report certain things? Well, that's, I think, seeing what they are required to report to HUD can be helpful. So in trying to then adapt the KCDBG programs to be ready to be able to do that, they're going to need to also then collect some information from you. So I wanted to show you, we're working on, hasn't been quite finalized yet, but we've got a draft that I'm going to share here, hopefully. So we seem to have a little issue with the system where I'm being muted when I switch to that other screen. So we are going to be sending you out, once this form has been finalized, a semi-annual Section 3 report form that each community will be asked to complete. And what it's going to ask you for, it's going to be collecting for that, you'll have to identify the project and the grant number. It will then be asking you to report on the total labor hours for that project to date, and then the qualifying Section 3 worker hours and the targeted Section 3 worker hours. So what we are proposing is that every 6 months, you will be asked for your active projects that are triggering Section 3 to report. So essentially, DLG can see that we're making progress on this, that tracking of those hours, total labor hours, and the Section 3 and targeted Section 3 hours are happening. And that report then will have a column for showing what was reported in the prior report. If this is, well, let's say this is 12 months into that project, we would show last reporting, the current reporting period, and then also that cumulative total. So if we have a project, maybe we're doing that $2 million, water treatment plant project that's going to take a while, we would be seeing those numbers grow over time. This form would also, a report would also ask that community to certify that they are implementing those qualitative steps where we're doing our outreach on this, because of course that's going to be our fallback position, that if we fail to meet the benchmarks, that those will, we have a backup plan to be able to ensure that we're going to be in compliance. So we are working on finalizing that report form. And that will be something that I assume will be sent out at the same time that your semi-annual reports are being sent out for Davis-Bacon. And so that will kind of line up with that. There are some communities we've spoken with who have decided that when they are getting the reporting from the employer, that they would be then seeking that information. So let's talk about those reporting considerations and then kind of focus on how would we collect that and sort of when. So I think we mentioned earlier that employers are not required to have, an electronic timekeeping system to be able to generate these kinds of reports. Probably with our larger employers, that's something that's already in place, but the employer can provide a good faith estimate. So we could at times be requiring that employer, along with, let's say, their certified payroll, we could be requiring them to complete and provide you with a good faith assessment of total labor hours for that either reporting period or to date, and then including reporting on qualifying Section 3 and targeted Section 3 workers. Now, we mentioned earlier about this professional service hours. So, let's use the example of we have maybe a law firm that is being paid out of this project. So the law firm itself, for those legal services, those are going to be something considered professional service hours because they have to have advanced education. They have to have the licensing or passed the bar to be able to work in your state. So those are generally going to be exempted as professional service hours, but the law firm, as part of what they're billing, may have some employees that are, have a function in this, who are being billed to this contract, who could actually qualify as Section 3 or targeted Section 3 workers. I don't know how often that would actually happen. And frankly, I would think in the example of something like the law firm, you're probably billing at a legal at a rate for the attorney that you're working with. And these are sort of behind the scenes folks that are incorporated into that single rate. But let's use the example of maybe we have a, I don't know, an accounting firm, and we have some employees based on your contract that we're actually billing individual employees, and they happen to have qualifying be qualifying individuals. We could capture their labor hours and be able to report that. So if you're going to use this sort of bonus, where if you happen to have within those professional service contracts some qualifying hours, that would also need to be incorporated into this reporting. We wouldn't count those hours in our total labor hours for the project, but we would incorporate those in our count of qualifying Section 3 or targeted Section 3 labor hours that have been completed. And so here again is a difference. So our HCD, which is what we're predominantly going to be working with, our CDBG or home ESG, disaster funding, those are all going to be reported overall for the project. But if you happened to be working in a project that also included public housing is actually having to report on an annual basis. So sometimes when we have mixed financing and it includes public housing assistance, it's going to make things a little bit more complicated because the timing, the definitions are a bit different between those two subparts of the rule. All right, so we've been talking about the qualitative reporting. Again, those are listed out within the regulations themselves at 7515B. And so there's a non-exhaustive list of what those qualitative efforts might be. And that, as Carrie showed you, would be something that in the absence of meeting those benchmarks, the 25 and 5%, then DLG is going to need to report on those into IDIS. So they're going to be collecting those from you in the final report for those so that they'll have them to be able to report. So I just wanted to go back over some examples on that. We talked about things like job fairs that could be held for workers. We might be, all of those efforts that you might be undertaking to try to identify and secure bids from Section 3 business concerns, those all are going to be counted as qualitative efforts. We talked about the Section 3 business registry and the opportunity portal. Anything you're doing to promote that use, including if you've said, we talked about having contractors being required to register in those portals or registries, that would be something you could count as a qualitative effort. We mentioned about, you might be doing some kind of working with like a one-stop or a job center program. All of those linkages, those community-based linkages that you're utilizing to support your Section 3 program would be something that would qualify. It doesn't have to be something that you are paying for with CDBG funds, but it's that you are utilizing that as part of your outreach efforts for Section 3. And then under capacity building, we talked about things like working with unions and encouraging apprenticeship opportunities. But we also see examples where we have a job center, maybe a technical school or other program that are working with potential workers, helping them get ready, maybe putting together a resume or coaching them on interviewing, helping them to be able to identify things like using the opportunity portal to identify when there are opportunities for them to submit an application for a job opportunity. That also, as I mentioned, might be then technical support that's going to those Section 3 business concerns and things like, getting ready to be biddable, how to get bonding, how to put together guarantees, or whatever it takes to be a viable bidder for that. And so in some cases we'll see things like linkages with financial literacy training or other kind of technical assistance that's being provided for businesses. And then on these connections, any of these sort of networking connections, postings that are being done are all things that could be captured as part of your qualitative efforts that you and your partners are completing as part of this. So as we mentioned, those qualitative efforts are going to be really important to make sure you always are documenting, because in the absence of hitting those 25 and 5% benchmark goals, we need to make sure that we have already completed the qualitative efforts and that we can then document those to be able to show, yeah, we're still okay, because we now, when that next screen pops up for DLG, when the big red X comes up and says, oh, you missed the 25% benchmark, DLG is going to get this next screen and they will have collected information from you saying, yes, we completed some of these qualitative reporting efforts. DLG will be marking that in IDIS. That project will be completed, considered to be in safe harbor or being in compliance. And as part of DLG's monitoring efforts, they may then be looking to see that backup documentation that you are maintaining. HUD might, in doing a monitoring, be then saying, I'd like to see backup documentation that's being maintained. So making sure that that record keeping is in place for that. All right, so we are really on the home stretch here. Wanted to identify some of the resources that are posted online, and then we're going to look at some sample forms that are available to you. So there is on HUD.gov, there is a landing page for Section 3. Also on the HUD Exchange, there is a Section 3 page. And for those of you, I'm hoping that most of you are registered on the HUD Exchange, but you can, as part of that registration, indicate the types of funding or regulations that you want to be notified of when there are updates and changes. I would suggest that you include Section 3 in that list. We mentioned this morning that we are hopeful that there will be this service area tool that's in beta testing. So you would automatically be notified when that is provided. On those landing pages, there also are frequently asked questions. And so, this is sort of an evolving, you all have asked really good questions. We've been doing trainings across the country, and from time to time, we are still getting questions where HUD needs to respond and provide further clarification. And so I would expect that those frequently asked questions are going to continue to grow. And so I think those would be helpful for you. As we mentioned, programs themselves are starting to issue notices. So this CPD Notice 2109 issued by the Office of Block Grant Assistance applies more specifically to CDBG. We mentioned the KCDBG handbook and specifically the attachment 4-3, which is the sample Section 3 plan. You are required to have a Section 3 plan. This gets you started with a sample, but as I encourage you to do, think about kind of growing that a bit, adding some further detail, and that may be a resource for you when you're trying to explain. Maybe you're doing that pre-bid conference, or you're having a pre-construction conference, being able to hand them not only your Section 3 plan, the sample that DLG has provided, but with some specifics about what your expectations are when. We're going to be looking at some of these sample forms. Those might be things that would be included in that. There is a tutorial that's posted on the HUD YouTube channel. I'm sure all of you spend a lot of time on the HUD YouTube channel, but there is a video about the opportunity portal and the business registry that might be helpful to you. It also might be helpful to partners, contractors, others that you're saying, well, I want you to use the business registry, and here is a video tutorial that you can utilize as part of that. HUD has also recently issued a Section 3 guidebook, which is this last link on the right side of the page. And there, not only is there a guidebook, but all these attachments that we're about to look at are also posted there. There are also postings of the nationwide trainings that have been done. We're going to be posting, I believe, the DLG training on the DLG website, and so you'll have those will be resources for you also. So what HUD did in trying to help a little bit on this was develop some sample forms, and these are not, you have to use this form, but it would be sort of a starting point for you to, okay, now I visually understand what this might look like. It can be adapted, as you need. It could be adopted just as it is, but I think a lot of folks are going to customize these a little bit, even if it's just putting it on, your letterhead. But I think also thinking about what's going to be user friendly for folks, what's going to work best and not be confusing. So in this list of documents that are available that might be a helpful resource for you is a sample Section 3 plan. And so it simply gives you some standard language, some standard areas that HUD anticipates that communities might want to use. This might be a place, if you were taking the DLG sample plan and wanting to build that out, you could borrow from this document. And I always think, rather than reinventing the wheel, if somebody else has come up with something that you can at least borrow from and tweak for your usage, saves everybody some time on this. So that's a resource for you. Also, there's a sample form that could be used as a self-certification form. So if you were going to go to workers and say, are you a resident of public housing or receiving a Section 8 housing choice voucher, asking about residency within a particular area, whether it's city, county, or particular boundaries. And then this also has standard language that would have to be modified for your particular income limits that you are using. That could be used as a way to collect that information, have the worker sign that, and then you could mark that indicating, okay, this is a qualifying Section 3 worker, this is a qualifying targeted Section 3 worker, and be able to use that as the basis for documentation that you or an employer were going to be collecting. There's also a sample form for Section 3 business concerns. And so this is, again, capturing, if you look on the bottom of this, you'll see, it's referencing to those ways to be able to qualify, looking at the ownership and control of that entity, or looking at their workforce and the percentages of labor hours that have been completed in the last 3-month period by qualifying workers. So this gives you a sample form that you can customize as suits you to be able to use for those needs. There also is a compliance checklist. Some of this really belongs more at the DLG level, but it also includes some items about documentation that you would have in place in reference to, worker hours, labor hours for that project. So there might be some things to borrow here for, file checklists that you might be using as part of your program implementation. All right, so that brings us to the end of the slides. We have a little bit of time here. Doesn't look like we have many additional questions here, but I see we've got a question. Could a contractor count a newer hired payroll clerk or other office employee that works directly on the project? Yes. So when we are looking at our labor hours for that project, these are hours that are being billed to that project. So they wouldn't only be limited to a an on-site labor for that project. If they're being billed off at an hourly rate to that project, they could be incorporated into that. Now, I think that gets a little messy in some cases when you are then thinking about, okay, let's say I have a little bit larger of a construction company, and the owner and maybe the chief financial officer, they're not being billed off on an hourly rate. They're not included in certified payrolls, but they may be paid out of the profit that's coming from that project, and so those would not be part of that. So I think it really relates to how they're being billed off. Now, that gets even messier potentially, and we see this, like for instance, if any of you are working with the home program, and think about the fact that with home, you could have some of your implementation be billed off to that project specifically. So let's say you are doing housing rehab and you have some projects that, because they've exceeded that $200,000 level, that they would be triggering Section 3. If I'm charging off my building inspector who's going out each time there's a draw request, if I'm charging that off as a project cost as opposed to coming out of admin, then I would be tracking those labor hours as part of my total project, and then determining, do my staff actually qualify as a targeted Section 3 or a Section 3 worker. I don't think that's going to be as common with CDBG, but it's essentially anybody that's being charged off as a labor hour towards that project would be included in total labor hours, and then we'd want to document if any of those workers actually qualified under one of our categories. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box at this point. Just as a reminder while we wait, if you have questions, you can go ahead and put questions in. I want to remind you that tomorrow from 10 to 11, we do have an office hour session. You're not required to attend, but we know that oftentimes after folks have left a training session and kind of thought about things later, then you realize, okay, I've got a couple more questions on how that's actually going to work. And I would think a lot of you are kind of that implementation head work on, okay, how will I implement this? And so you have another opportunity tomorrow between 10 and 11. If you have additional questions, you can, with the original information that was sent out to you by Jennifer, there was a link included for tomorrow's session. You can use that if you have questions. You can use that if you want to listen in and see if there are some questions that others raise that would be helpful to you. While we wait and see if there are any last questions that come in, I want to thank everybody for, I know this has been a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. I know that right now everybody is working really diligently on, you've had CV funding, your regular CDBG. A lot of you are really working to keep ahead of things. I know Carrie and I oftentimes find ourselves in the same situation. So it may not be welcome news that there's a new Section 3 rule, but we hope that this training has helped you understand how's that going to work, what are the implications for implementing this, and as there are additional questions, we encourage you, tomorrow in the office hour session, but after that, work with staff at DLG. We'll be working with them. There are questions that still we don't have an answer yet from HUD, so keep an eye out for frequently asked questions. And we'll work with DLG if there are things that there isn't an answer for. We'll work on trying to make sure that that happens for folks. Jennifer, any closing remarks that you want to make?
Yes, I just want to say thank you to CF. Y'all did a great job today. I also want to, I think we had some really good questions today. So I really appreciate everybody paying attention and asking such good questions. And I do encourage folks to, like, say you're at your office, get with some of your coworkers and maybe talk through this, maybe come up with a scenario of where this is going to affect you and come up with your questions and hop on tomorrow for a little bit and give us those questions. But if you can't hop on tomorrow, maybe you could email them to me and then I can send them onto the team. But anyway, I do want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to thank ICF for their great presentation today.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So it was nice to have Carrie with me this afternoon. We had Andelin this morning. We really hope this was helpful for you. We'll give you a couple minutes of your day back, 2 minutes, woo. And hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.